I do want to make a disclosure. We are doing a very good job at the National Association of EMS Physicians of sharing information with one another. There is a lot of people who've been involved with this at the Standards and Protocol Committee at the national level. And there was a lot of input, and some of these slides are literally verbatim from some of these people on the PowerPoint here. And some of these are from personal insights, how their services are doing things, sample protocols, et cetera, and kind of how they're planning on rolling stuff out. So this is very much a synopsis and a compilation of a lot of other people's hard work, so I do want to give them credit for that. The objectives here, there's a lot, but we basically kind of want to understand where we came from, a little bit of history. We're going to look at the evidence or lack thereof. And then the benefits of reducing the use of the long spine board in the field. And then we'll look at some example protocols that are being used throughout the U.S. As well as internationally. And then we'll talk about what we think we have to do to get this to be protocolized here and kind of the barriers to getting this implemented. We're really trying to do our best to divorce the long spine board from C-collars. And when we rolled this out, we really didn't want to say we're taking C-collars away, we're taking the way we assess a C-spine away. We're still advocating excellent spinal care. We still want providers to assess the spine. We still want the providers to look at every trauma patient as a potential for having a spinal injury. We're just saying that those two things, the long spine board and having a spine injury, don't necessarily have to be married together, and that they're not spine board deficient if they have a spinal injury necessarily. So we really still want to advocate good care, good physical assessment, and we're not talking about our C-spine clearance. We're still going to do the same clearance criteria that we would normally do. If the patient needs a C-collar, we put a C-collar on them. That's the end of the debate right there. We put the C-collar on. We actually think not linking the C-collar to a long spine board will actually improve C-collar, or actually probably increase C-collar use inadvertently, because the elderly patient who's fallen from ground height and who's kind of kyphotic and stuff, the crews now have to make a decision to go, do we have to do the entire package or nothing? And you may be left with the option now of putting the collar on without the long spine board. So we're not talking about C-spine here. We're strictly talking about the long spine board. We will discuss a little bit about C-collars when we get to penetrating trauma, but in general, this is really the long spine board. We're trying to divorce those two things. The scope of this, just to show you how big of an issue it is, it's big. I mean, we have a lot of spine injuries in the country every year. However, this is the neat number. Very few actually have the problem. I actually have an unstable issue or an actual spine injury. This is how many people are seen in the ER for that, but very few have an actual injury. Okay, we have a lot of people with complaints of spinal injuries, but very, very few actually have the problem. Some of the dogma around spinal immobilization, which we all know, this is kind of how it flows. Trauma equals an unstable spine. Spine cord injury then results, obviously, we get permanent neurologic deficit, and that's bad. That's kind of how it's been forever. We assume that trauma could lead to that, and that that's a thing that we can somehow impact in the field. Any additional movement may worsen an injury that's already there, and it may cause an injury. So let's say they did break their neck or their back, but we then are going to cause a cord injury because of how we handle them. So that's kind of how it's always been taught. Further injury is avoided by mobilizing the spine. So what we currently do, we think is better or helping them, and we think it's a safe procedure. And that's kind of how the dogma and all the textbooks are talking about it and how we've all been taught. And then obviously there's the medical legal issues which prevent change because people have a disincentive financially to pursue this kind of thing. A little bit of the history, how we got from this, which makes sense because this is an easy way to carry people, versus to this, and there is an evolution of that, and it's kind of awkward, but this makes sense. This is kind of crazy, and we ended up getting here, and you could probably throw a kit on under that to make it really pretty, and then add some more tape and some redundancy and more straps here, and that's where we currently are. In looking at other people's reviews and looking through the literature and stuff, there's some old stuff these are some case series that were done in the 50s, where they're trying to go, how did we end up where we're at? And the best thing that we can figure out is this guy Geisler, which I'd really like to meet this guy, was a surgeon, and basically this was published in the 60s. And he had some tiny 29 patients in their review, and basically decided that delayed onset of paraplegia in a guy who had a skull fracture He blamed that on improper handling, faulty handling right here. Further paralysis through faulty handling. So boom, here in 1966, we've got this doctor saying, you know what, we had a guy who wasn't paralyzed when he came in and he became paralyzed. Let's blame the people who touched him first. And then we think the ball dropped there. And it was kind of a dumb decision. Because let's think, we're basing all of our decisions and all of our kind of dogma on 29 patients that clearly weren't caused paralysis. The injury caused their paralysis, not the EMS providers. And so what we did is now the medical community believes that we've got to immobilize stuff because we don't want to have that risk of delayed paralysis. And clear is that occult spinal column injury. So it's that lady walking around going, I don't know, should I go? We become concerned that there's an occult spinal fracture there, and that what we've got to do is immediately immobilize her from head to toe, right? So that's kind of where part of this started. Here's another place, or another gentleman, Farrington, in '68. They described the use of this, it's called extrication of victims in their Journal of Trauma in 1968. They basically said that this is great for these short boards or hard boards are good for extricating patients so they wouldn't sag. So their head and neck wouldn't sag. So basically, instead of pulling them out by their arms and letting their whole body just flop like a kind of a fish, they're basically saying, hey, it's nice to have hands freed up for rescuers. You can pass somebody along a nice board and put them onto the cot or whatever. This was never envisioned to be a long-term device that actually mobilized somebody. That's not the intent of this. They were just saying that it frees the hands of the rescuers. And then here we have the quintessential beginning of formal EMS, the Johnny and Roy. And they included in this, they advocated spinal immobilization, used the backboard and C-collar with signs and symptoms of spinal injury. So that's kind of where it formally began adopted as opposed to just kind of through case reports and such. 1970s and 80s, now we've got some more stuff. This goofball linked delayed paraplegia in hospitalized patients, and he called these injuries underappreciated. That's a quote. He said they were underappreciated. So he blamed EMS, inevitable knee-jerk response of EMS, because that's what we do. We get told something happened, and then we have to go all the way the other direction to prevent anything ever from ever happening again. So we had the typical knee-jerk response. Then we began applying spinal mobilization to mechanism only. So now you don't have neck or back pain, but you fell over. That's trauma. We got to put you on a board and collar. So that's kind of went full circle. It went from all the way from we didn't do anything, we're in the military, using litters and throwing people over our shoulders and running through the battlefield, to now you fell and you don't have any pain, to complete immobilization. So it's kind of like the evolution of spine board. I think spine boards are kind of like this. They seem like a good idea in the beginning. There's the floating foot, what do you call them, the sandals. And it seemed like a smart plan, but I think after we realize it, after we look at it, what seemed like a good idea in the beginning to power the grill probably isn't going to end up panning out. So we're going to talk about the evidence, and there is a paucity of it. And just to start off, when we're looking at evidence, there's no randomized controlled trials. There's no prospectively done large-scale trials on this because, well, one, it's probably never going to happen. And so I want to start with that. The evidence that we're going to talk about is low-grade evidence. This is retrospective stuff, cohort studies, case series. This is not some high-end evidence-based medicine where we've got some really great quality of studies to go on. We don't have much. So we'll talk about it, though. We do have some evidence that it does cause harm, though. Respiratory compromise. We know it causes respiratory compromise in healthy volunteers. We know that. Now, it causes respiratory compromise when you strap someone down flat to a board and cinch their collars or cinch their chest straps tight. What is that? So that's a healthy patient, right? So their respiratory capacity diminishes. What if you have a pulmonary contusion? What if you have a hemothorax? What if you have a pneumothorax? What if you got a history of CHF? What if you're a polytrauma patient and you have an airway issue and you strap someone down? So we can extrapolate that if in healthy people, it's probably not the best thing for critically injured patients either. More evidence for harm. We do know it causes pressure sores and tissue hypoxia. We know that. When you lay people on the boards, they measure this with direct tissue oxygenation monitors, and you can see that they clearly have, on the points of contact with the hard board, tissue hypoxia. It occurs. That's worse for patients who are injured and have spine injuries. People that can adjust and wiggle themselves on a board and say that hurts, get me off, and move around and kind of get themselves a little bit more comfortable, who have sensation, are better off than the patient who has a complete spinal cord injury and can't feel anything. So if you have a flaccid body laying there, they can't feel pressure. They don't know that they're hurting. Their sacrum's digging into the board. That's even a higher risk patient. What about an elderly patient? The points of contact on a kyphotic old lady, you're really emphasizing that contact on that hard board. And they have worse, worse protein, nutrition, so they're making even sores more readily. So we know that this is a bad part about boards. More evidence for harm. Increased pain. We know when we strap healthy subjects down to a board, they get complaints. They get complaints that weren't there before they were strapped to the board. They were just like you and me, walking around. They said, hey, let's strap you to this board and pin you down. And they developed nausea, vertigo, headaches, back pain, neck pain, and they were healthy. So now again, if I'm in a car accident and I was doing okay, I had isolated neck pain before you strapped me down. Now I get to the hospital, I got pain right here. I've got pain in my T-spine. Now I've got the headache. They get the CT scan of their brain. They get more plain films of their back. They get all this stuff that they may not have gotten in the first place. So we know this is true too. And Sabina, when you roll someone off a board, where's always the red spot? Right there, right in the T-spine. It's always the spot that they hurt. Nope. And there's a big red spot from where the board was if they were on it for any length of time. And then you're kind of stuck. Now they got pain when you're pushing. And we know it's probably from the board, but what are you going to do? More evidence for harm. We know it does increase unnecessary radiologic imaging as well. Now that's both a cost and a radiation issue. We know that radiation is not a benign thing anymore, that scanning everything just for fun is not the best method, it's not the best thing. We try to minimize desperately the amount of radiation kids are receiving, young adults. If you're 70, 80, 90, don't really care as much because you're not probably going to live long enough to have the negative effects of radiation. But if you're 40 and younger, that's probably a big deal. And so we don't really know the quantification yet. We haven't really quantified what the actual risk is. We know it does correlate positively with cancers. And kids are much more susceptible to radiation-induced injury. And so this is a big deal. And we'll get to some more studies on how this is negative in kids too. This guy, Oswald's awesome. Does he come to NAMSP or anything? Do you ever met him? He's written a couple great articles on this stuff. He's an emergency physician down in New Mexico. And this is just showing that basically this is kind of one of those rare things where the third world, or the non-first world, has, they serve as very good case controls for some medical things that we couldn't do here. So places that don't have ACLS and are completely devoid of any advanced care, they have a good opportunity to implement something and look at the before and after. So in this case, they basically compared spinal outcomes, spine trauma patients who were immobilized and those who weren't. And in Malaysia, they didn't do it to anybody, right? That wasn't in their EMS system. Anybody who was injured, they just threw them on the cot and they took them to the hospital. And he compared those in New Mexico who were 100% boarded and collared. And basically what he found was, this is just going through the demographics here of the average age and where their injuries were and comparing the two and the mechanisms. And bottom line, and this is the distribution of where their injuries were. We'll get to the important part. Here's the odds ratio, which is the important number here. The spinal immobilization has a 2 odds ratio that was significant, and you can see the ranges here for the confidence interval. Basically, you had twice as high a chance of disability if you were immobilized versus the cohort that was not in the other part of the world. Similar anatomic injuries, similar mechanisms, that kind of thing. When they standardized for all of it and they did logistic regression and they accounted for all of those differences, it was still statistically significant. Okay, so they tried to account for injury severity and things like that. And basically that was a good look at saying, interesting. Now we don't know causative, this isn't high-end, super high-grade evidence, but again, it's just another little thorn in the side of what we've currently been doing. More evidence for harm. 2012 here, pediatric trauma patients. This was a prospective cohort. I think, I can't remember the total number of patients. It was in the hundreds. They did, in kids, if you were spinally immobilized, spinal immobilization was associated with increased pain. The pain scale went from a 3 to a 2, so not a tremendous difference. Radiographic usage, which was a huge deal, and increased admission. That was just by being spinal immobilized. They compared the trauma patients that were and weren't immobilized. Now, your cervical radiography, that's a big deal. A CT scan of a neck in a kid, that is not a goal. That is something that we would like to avoid. And we do more plain films at children's for that because one, their risk of injury is so much lower, but two, this is a big deal. So radiation's a big deal, and look at the difference, 56 versus 13%. So what I'm saying here is why EMS is important in driving what hospitals do. You guys aren't going to put people on boards when we deliver them to your cot, but you need to understand why we're maybe delivering them to you without a board. And so that's really, we in EMS really do impact what happens in hospitals. I mean, you think of hypothermia, pre-hospital. EMS across the country was driving that change into the hospitals before the hospitals were doing it. And so there's a lot of things that EMS does that really impacts in-hospital care. So by us, as EMS people, we're choosing to bring a kid on a board or not, this makes a big difference. They might not get admitted as much, a lot different, and they may get less radiation. So it's one, a cost and a benefit to the patient outside of when we drop them off that's impacting what they do in the hospital. Turns out if you bring a kid without a spinal package to me at Children's, it looks like I might be less likely to do some radiographs and maybe admit them. That's what that study showed. Again, there's limitations with all these studies, but that was interesting. Penetrating trauma and spinal mobilization. This is where we are going to talk about C-collars a little bit because specifically in our protocol here in Johnson County, we're changing this. And so in January during the core drive-through training and December and February with all the BLS core drive-through training, we're going to be hammering this because basically spinal immobilization in a penetrating trauma patient doubles mortality. That's the short story. It's bad. So it's not like we can do it and go, well, I just thought it was the best. No, stop doing it. This is one of those things that hurts people. And so this is clear. The trauma surgeons in our own system have bought in this hook, line, and sinker and said, stop doing it. And Dr. Fishman here at Overland Park Regional said, we should not be doing that. Unequivocally, without fail, stop doing it. And we'll get into a little bit of the evidence of why we decided to do that. But we got the American Academy of Neurologic Surgeons, so our neurosurgeon friends say it. American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma says it. NMSP supports that. It's in PHTLS and ATLS as well, is that the benefits really aren't there and the risks aren't proven. This is a busy slide, but the bottom line is this was a big retrospective study, and basically it looks at people who got shot in the torso, and it says basically thoracolumbar immobilization is almost never beneficial. Okay, fair enough. We'll get to plenty more. We don't need just that one. Here's another one that the conclusion basically after 45,000 patients were reviewed that 43% of them had spinal immobilization, so about half. And this is the one that said higher mortality is associated with this. You can see here the odds ratio is 2. This is a big study with 45,000 patients and basically doubled your risk of dying if you had immobilization done. Another big study with 57,000 trauma patients evaluated by different mechanisms, and as you can guess, no penetrating trauma, no patient with penetrating spinal cord injury regained neurologic recovery. If you get shot in the spine, that's bad. A C-collar and a long spine board aren't going to fix that. Okay, and we'll get to some biomechanics and physics of why you think that's counterintuitive, that immobilization would be better if you got shot in the spine, but we'll get to that. So basically, this author's conclusion is don't get shot in the cord. If you get a neurologic deficit from a penetrating assault, you are going to have a horrific, bad wound that's final at the time of injury. Okay? So if I have a 9mm shoot through my spine and just the cavity just explode my cord, you could dance him like a puppet and it wouldn't matter, right? That cord injury is complete. Okay? So there's no chance that they're going to regain recovery. And the point is, don't waste time packaging, and the tiny little movements that we do in the field are careful, cautious, thoughtful movements are not furthering that injury. And we'll get into a little bit more about the biomechanics and the actual physics of that in a little bit. More harm for penetrating trauma. Another study here in 2009 in New Orleans. They reviewed patients, basically C-spinal immobilization was associated with increased risk of death, which is always bad. And they also talked about here No patient had indirect C-spine injury in this cohort. So if you get shot in the head, this was just people who got shot in the head, there's no indirect cord injury, or spinal injury. So if you get shot in the head, then people are like, well, let's immobilize the spine. Okay. This was saying basically that if you get shot in the head, you don't have like a concussive effect or an indirect, some sort of cord injury. You know, the concussion from the gunshot or whatever, your neck is not something you need to be concerned about. And the patients that did have a direct C-spine injury, it was readily apparent. You get shot and you're, in the spine. But again, that injury is spinal at the time of injury. Our gentle movements in the field and our little extrication, getting to the cot and stuff, that's not their problem at that point. They were just shot in the spine. So we need to change how we view what we do to those patients. More intubation attempts were also noted with the cervical collars. And they conclude this indirect spinal injury does not occur with gunshot wounds to the head. That was what they came away with. So we don't have to worry, and I've run several gunshot wounds to the head in this county, and they're inevitably in a C-collar. And so we don't need to. Remember what C-collars also, we're not going to talk about C-collars too much, but they increase ICP, they reduce venous return, they make your airway care more complicated. So bottom line, and we'll get to the end at the end about how this impacts us, is that we're not going to be doing spinal immobilization in these patients. Another study, Dubois, GSWs to the head, neck, or torso. None had unstable spinal injuries. Okay, a couple had required surgery. Remember, 2 out of 4,000. So again, we're overestimating what we think is their underlying problem. We think if there's some trauma that these guys are getting a neurosurgeon, they got an unstable spine. It just doesn't pan out when you look at these huge groups of patients over and over and over. Here's the American Academy of Neurologic Surgeons position. This is this year, 2013. This is a quote, spinal immobilization in patients with penetrating trauma is not recommended because of increased mortality from delayed resuscitation, okay? If you get shot, your biggest problem is if I have a C-collar and a board on, okay? So, but it's a paradigm shift. It's going to take some beating out of the culture, but it's not without good reason, and we're probably delayed in this. Here's PHTLS. There are no data to support routine spinal immobilization in patients with penetrating trauma to the neck or torso. So notice it says neck. If I got shot in the neck, it's saying there's no data to support it. And we know that C-collars can cause harm. Okay, so this is penetrating traumas. We need to chuck that stuff. We need to pick them up and put them on the cot and go to the hospital. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the overreaching concern about the neck motion and back movement and stuff with a little bit of biomechanics. And again, spinal immobilization should never be done at the expense of accurate physical exam. So just last night I was working at Truman, and a drunk guy fell over, went boom, smacked the back of his head. He was in our drunk tank in the locked area. And I asked the resident, well, does that lac need to be sewed? She said, well, I don't know, he had a C-collar on. All right, wrong answer. I mean, he could be bleeding from that, right? And we need to know if he's got like an open skull or brain hanging out. But because he was in the collar, well, I didn't want to roll. I mean, he was in the collar. I couldn't see. That's the problem. I've been on calls where people have been shot in the face and the head, and they had a collar on obscuring the hemorrhage. Okay? Now that happens, and I'm not faulting anybody. It happens because it's chaotic, they're sick, but when a C-collar comes up to here, kind of right up to here, and you get shot here, and you're bleeding to death, and you leave a pool of blood in the ambulance this big, and it runs you into the ER and they're hypotensive, 2 fingers right here probably would have been life-saving. But we couldn't see it because we have our all-important collar on, right? So it's not important. We really do have to maintain that accurate physical exam, and we can see things. We're not obscuring the whole neck. If I get shot in the neck, last thing I want to do is cover it up. I want to see if there's an expanding hematoma. I want to see if I want to watch that area. So I don't want to obscure it with a C-collar. Here's a Cochrane review. Unwarranted spinal immobilization can expose patients to the risks of pain, skin ulceration, aspiration, respiratory compromise. And see, we just talked about that resulting in unnecessary radiography. This kind of summarizes all those first slides and what they were getting at from. And at increased cost and longer hospital stays. So they're really doing a good job selling it, aren't they? I mean, it's just saying bad. The potential risks of aspiration, respiratory compromise are of concern because death from asphyxiation was a major cause of preventable trauma. So they're saying, not a lot of evidence, okay? Here's the Eagles. This is a group of all the biggest cities EMS medical directors in the country. Now the Eagles tend to be even more aggressive and on the leading edge of pushing the envelope, I guess is the best way to say that. They basically, similar to what we've just said, there are no randomized trials to evaluate benefits. A growing body of literature points to the potential deleterious effects of spinal immobilization. So they just basically, the horse is out of the barn, if you will. Now the Eagles don't like C-collars either. They took it one step further and talked about, we might therefore, now we're not recommending this, but I just want to show you where I think the future's heading. Discontinue the use of cervical collars in alert cooperative trauma patients, even with suspected C-spine, okay? And remove collars from their protocols for management of patients with penetrating trauma. So the Eagles are saying, take them out for penetrating, we're doing that. But I think there's probably going to be some push for the alert and oriented cooperative patient sometime in the future where, maybe that's 5 years from now, whatever, as I think so I think that we're kind of heading down that path where we're going to reevaluate everything we're doing. Evidence for benefit. There we are, okay? So we have the assumption that they actually do immobilize the spine, that what we're doing actually works. We do know that there's 3 points of contact here, the occiput, the T-spine, the L-spine. It's just the normal curve of your spine, right? This is when you lay a flat board where the 3 places that they're hitting. You're not immobilizing these segments right here, or these segments right here, or that there, or that there. It's literally you have this 3 points of contact. And Natalie, there you are. We painted a student with not just for fun, but with the intent of kind of showing the points of contact on a board. And when we kept him laying down without bending, and we lowered him down flat, put him on a board, and then pulled him back up. And you can see where the points of contact are. We always know they are, right there in the head, the T-spine, and the butt. None of this here, none of the C-spine, nothing there. And so this is where we know the points of contact are. This is a commercial. This slide, this was for some ProTech backboard pad, like they were demonstrating. But they used pressure sensors. They put pressure sensors on the board. This is the normal, and competitors gel. But this is what we're doing, right? We got boop right there. You're getting nice point of contact right there, nice T-spine, and nice butt and sacrum. So the entire spine here is not even being touched, and neither is that. So we know that's what our boards look like. Now this is what our EMS cot would look like probably, right? But this is what their backboard with that gel, they were trying to distribute the weight across people. They were selling a product, but this was a great view of what a pressure sensor would look like on our board. How well do boards immobilize us? We're making the assumption that our boards and what we currently do immobilize us well. So in 1994, Mazalowski, they did different strapping techniques in cooperative volunteers. Remember, one of the caveats to Steinboard studies is no one's ever done it in a patient population very well, okay? These are all healthy volunteers, a lot of this stuff. And they were cooperative, and they found that most of them were all able to move when they were strapped. So this concept of immobilization, it is restricting it more. And I know there's people who are changing their verbiage to say restriction as opposed to immobilizing. Here's another study they did during transport. We're on a slippery board. You're subject to side movement still, right? But we do a great job of fixing the head to the board. We smash that head down. We've got things on the side of it. We've got tape. We've got straps, and that head is fixed. And the rest of their body may or may not be fixed, right? And so if we take a nice current turn, what are we doing? We're moving the body a little bit to the side while their head's nice and fixed. Now that just doesn't seem logically right, but that's what we've been doing for a long time. So remember, the board is slippery, and it does have a low friction surface, so it doesn't allow our body to move without our head being fixed in place. Here's another one in 2007. This was a prospective one. It showed 70% of patients, when they came in, they looked at them, there were at least 4 or more centimeters of slack. And some of them had 12% of them had 4 or more backboard straps with 4 centimeters slack. Now, that in a hurry, now let's be honest, right? Immobilizing somebody with the collar or the straps that we use in this system as well is very subjective to how well the provider's putting it on and where they snug it up in the armpits, or it's more down and there's a gap between the hole and the board, where they fit their body habitus. It's unique. You have to understand. We would all admit that. And so, but this just documented that when people came in, there's a lot of slack. This isn't something that's like keeping the body from moving. If you rolled them when they were vomiting, their body will flunk and they'd slide down, but their head's nice and fixed. So we know this. Combative patients, this is interesting. We'll talk about this more when we get into the biomechanics a little bit. We usually pin them down onto a board while they squirm violently, right? And so we end up doing that, and what we're doing is fixating and focusing the energy onto the spine. Right? We say we're doing it for their benefit. Now sometimes it might be for crew protection, it might be for safety, as a way to literally maybe duct tape them to the wall. It's to keep them from hurting us. That's understandable at times. But in general, we would always use the excuse that, well, we gotta get this guy aboard, protect himself from him, protect his C-spine from himself. If he's fighting you like a grizzly bear, his C-spine's pretty well protected, right? And if he has an unstable C-spine, well, okay, but the fact that he's tap dancing all over your back while he's beating you says that he's probably got a more healthy spine than you do. But we would always always argument that, well, we got to get this, strap them down. So we pin their board down, we force their forehead down, and they're doing one of these. Now, what is that actually doing to the amount of force that's applied to the spine? If physics at all says that that's worse, that's applying more kinetic energy, right? That's applying more energy to the actual spine than passive movement, letting them comfortably lay in position of comfort, leaving them alone, trying to get them to just lay on the cot and be quiet and being happy with that. That's imparting no energy on their spine, right? Laying there, or just curling up in a ball, or whatever they want to do to leave them alone, as opposed to fighting them. So that's a practice that will probably change over time. So again, this likely increases the force and energy is transmitted to the spine. Much better to have a collar on and get into position of comfort. Forced immobilization is worse than no immobilization. So we'll talk about this article a fair amount because this guy has an amazing amount of verbiage to talk. And you shouldn't try to reword stuff when it's eloquently said. Attempting to enforce immobilization of the uncooperative patient may result in more force transmission to the spine than before the struggle commenced. And that's a weird statement, but it's true. The clinical significance of strap tightness as far as immobilizing, we don't know. We don't know if you strap them down tighter if that makes them more immobilized, but what do you do when you strap someone down tighter? You make them breathe worse, right? I mean, if I can strap me down as tight as you want, well, that serves what purpose? What are you trying to make happy? You're trying to get that spine extra still, right, at the expense of their lungs? So we really don't know. We really can't quantify right now. If you're still able to move on a backboard, then it's more a function of cooperation than it is actual technique, right? If I could tell anybody just lay really still, and you don't need any straps, right? Because we don't strap people down in the ER. I mean, they might have 6 fractures in their spine and can't feel the legs. They're not strapped, and they're certainly not on a hard board. They're just laying there. Don't move. And if you're alert and oriented, you wouldn't move. So that's more a function of our cooperation of the patient as opposed to what we're doing. Again, the limitations of these cooperative, healthy volunteers, we're not making any rash statement like this is hardcore evidence that should seal the deal. We're trying to get buy-in to understand where we're coming from. We think this is the best thing for patients. What about scoops? Scoop structures work well. They had the same able to restrict motion of the spine as well as a long spine board. That's great news because guess what? We have scoops. And scoops are a transient thing. You put it on to move them to the cot, right? They don't stay on the scoop usually. And so this is an excellent thing to use, and we'll talk about that. But this just documented that it has the similar type of spine motion as a board. What extrication techniques cause the least spine movement? This was great. This was done over in WashU a few years ago. It used video motion capture, right? They put you've seen the stick figure biomechanics things that in the computer generated models where they can measure movement. They put markers on the patient's spines and the shoulders and clavicles and chin. They looked at relationships and how things moved. And basically they did fake extrication from a car with that video motion capture. And they did the 4 standard techniques. They did self-extrication, put a collar on, self-extrication, the 4-person crew where they wiggle the feet out first, or the head out, and then they use the KED. So they used kind of all the traditional techniques that we would use except the ones about self-extrication. So these are the 4 techniques. And the patient was allowed to exit the vehicle and line aboard. The patient was allowed to exit the vehicle on their own with a seat collar The patient was extricated head first via stand, so this is what we're used to doing, and the patient was extricated with a kid. And guess what they found? The least movement of the cervical spine in subjects who had cervical collar applied and were allowed to simply get out of the car and lie down on the stretcher. Boom. Right? I mean, was that surprising? Or does that kind of make sense? I mean, I know it's hard. I mean, I know it's just, it goes out of the, throws everything out the window what you've been taught, that we were somehow doing a better job than an alert and oriented patient could do. Because if I stood up from this chair and stood up and went like this, and went like this, and sat on the cot, and then carefully were laid down, that's safe, right? And so specifically if they don't have any neurologic findings, and they just have isolated neck or back pain. So that's going to change our world, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another one that was just published this year. I can't remember who did this or where it was at, but they did the exact same thing. They did 4 firefighters and 2 paramedic crews, so a typical kind of crew here in Johnson County, marked with biomechanical sensors, relative movement sensors, high-speed infrared motion analysis cameras, the same kind of thing. They did all that stuff. You know, they did conventional extrication techniques record up to 4 times more cervical spine movement than controlled self-extrication. 4 times more. So our standard, what we're teaching in paramedic school, all the textbooks, what we do when we get on scene now, 4 times more motion was captured than just, ma'am, just keep your back and neck still and we're going to help you to the cot here. And how fast is that? Get out of the car and sit on the cot, right? And how many people does it take to do that? Maybe 2, 1 to get the cot and 1 to I mean, not all kinds of people, right? So we're talking about, freeing up a little bit of resources too on a MVC with, 3 type greens. I mean, you don't need 9 people there. Ambulance cots, and this is what I want to start calling the ambulance cot. And this is this is a dogma shift. They are the padded long spine boards we always knew we should have been using. We always said padded long spine boards were better, right? If they padded all the voids and stuff. We've got that. It's called a cot. Have you seen our cots? They're not beds in the hospital. They're not ER beds. They're a little thin in the middle, right? And they got a little scoop to them. And they're the perfect thing to immobilize the spine on and to help lay somebody on. So it's flat. They can be secured to it. And it can conform to that, it's a non-stick surface too. And they don't have the downsides that backboards have. They're more comfortable. They still have a way to secure people to them. They're straight. This is our cot. See how thin this is right here in the middle? This is where their back and neck go, and it kind of cradles them a little bit. This is the padded long spine board we've always been asking for, and we had them all the time. We repainted that student and laid him on our own cot mattress. Here's the cot. Here's this. How much difference is there? More area of contact for his head instead of the little dot there. I mean, it's cradling, it's more comfortable. And you see how it kind of goes up the sides here and kind of cradles them. You see here's the spine in the middle. So now you see this has a lot more areas of contact. 1, more comfortable, and 2, we've had this all the time. And so we're still not taking bad care of the spine. We're not advocating for, right angle bends and turns and, pivoting them and stuff like that. We're talking about laying them on a firm surface that's more comfortable in a cot. Now we'll talk about just the logical side of it, about reducing the use in the field. So we've all been on this patient, right? Every day. I mean, the average age of our transports here is what, 800? I mean, it's got to be, it's what is it, 60, something like that? 50, it's up there. And this is a lot of patients. Now, how is this, what kind of force do you think is applied to this guy's neck when you lay him down? Now it's actually gravity's pulling it down, right? When he was sitting upright on a cot, there'd be much less force exposed as the fulcrum here of the neck, right? So we know these never really benefit from long spine board, but man, we've been doing it forever. I'm guilty of it, everybody in this room's guilty of it, and we do it because now there was that decision, well, demented grandma has a cut on her lip, she fell down, no one saw it. Wow, now it's that moment of truth, like are we gonna pin her down, or are we gonna just, let's hope no one asks, and put her on the cot? And because if you put the collar on, you gotta go full package, right? Well, hopefully we'll fix that and we'll be able to have a little bit of that. But we got to take a look at the risk benefit here. This seat collars and spine boards don't do well here. But you'll have the opportunity now to do good care of the spine and take better care of the patient. This is a great slide. This is a faulty assumption. we presume that, oh, well, hey, doc, we're only in the field for 10 minutes with them, right? They're only on that board for 10 minutes, 5 minutes sometimes. It was at, right next to Olathe, the Good Sam or whatever. They're not on that board for any length of time. Wrong. We assume that as soon as they hit that door, they're off that board in 2 seconds. That is a wrong assumption. And depending on where you are in this world, you might be on that board for a very long time. Now, if you're at Truman Medical Center, we've told the nurses, you interrupt us. You grab a resident. You grab one of the attendings. You say, hey, we got a patient who's on the board, call her, can you get him off? Children's is excellent at this. They literally walk in, we got a patient. It doesn't matter what we're doing. They will grab somebody to come say, we got a kid on a board, can you come get him off? Which is a great thing. And some places have been aggressive enough that the nurses clear that and they get them off the board and roll them off, which is even better. So, there are people and doctors in this community who are leaving people on the board until their radiographs or CTs are done, read by the radiologist, and then when they get to it, we'll take them off. Now, I'm just telling you that. I know that for a fact. That is not good. So that is a bad thing for that patient, okay? So there are people who are still doing that. So we are actually going to impact and improve the care these patients may get based on what we're doing in the field. We're taking them off the board for you. Guess what? You don't have to go run and grab a doctor as soon as that old lady hits the door or that minor MVC because they're never on a board to start with. We don't have to have that logistics at the hospital. Well, I got Dr. So-and-so's doing a lac repair with, he's busy doing a sedation. Well, she's just going to have to linger on that board. Oh, then a trauma came in. And we were at Truman the other day, several months ago, and 3 GSWs walked through the door at the same time, dumped off at the front. Well, there was also a couple of spine-boarded MVC patients in the back 40. Everybody left to go to the traumas. Just bad luck. An hour later, oh yeah, we got those guys in the back hall. You can help me get them off. Now, what do you think their complaints were? Hey, I just came in with my knee hurting, but now I hurt from head to toe. Can you imagine being on a board for an hour? So it happens. So we're actually driving improving care in the field, and it's going to translate to the hospital. It really will help. Should I go to the hospital? Here's this lady. This is every call that we go on that's a minor. Where's the damage again? You come out and show me. Where is it? And then you say, okay, this mechanism's significant. Let's go ahead and call her. She's got neck pain, and she's rubbing her neck like this, doing some deep knee bends, stretching, saying it hurts when I do that. And now we have to go, hold her head, dude, right? Because what if we didn't hold her head? Because she was doing yoga before we got here. And so we know that this patient intuitively, just think logically, we knew this intuitively forever that patient didn't have a broken neck, right? And even if they did, what kind of fracture was it? Not the kind that pits you and makes you collapse and crumple, right? It's the kind that is okay. The kind that will go home in a Philadelphia collar or Miami J, and they'll follow up a neurosurgery clinic. They'll walk out, get in their car, right? Go to the store. They're not on a board. So we knew this intuitively. We always knew that. Now, granted, I'm going to always throw the caveat out there. Spinal fusion patients, elderly patients, osteoporotic, they're always higher risk patients. But again, the long spine board isn't their answer necessarily. Okay, that's not helping them. So we're still doing good assessments. But these minor falls, ambulatory patients, the standing takedown, really? They were walking, okay? So one, stable injury. And even if they're not, just get them supine. Put them in a collar. So we're still assessing their spine well. But, when they're already ambulatory, we knew this logically, that there's no chance that wow, I didn't realize he broke his entire spine. So we've never had that conversation. No one's ever said, yeah, that guy who was mowing his lawn and he said he fell yesterday off the roof, then we did this to him, So we knew that intuitively. Minor VCs, and what do you do with the walk-ins? Truman, we get people everybody drinks and they all fall off their roof. I don't know how people get on their roofs all the time. There are people who don't have houses. They're always on roofs. And so last night I had a guy that was in room 22, and the resident's like, yeah, this guy's been drinking. I'm like, yeah, him and everybody else I saw last night, everybody was drunk. And I said, well, yeah, he says his knee's hurting, this and that, and he fell off his roof. I'm like, he fell off his roof? I'm like, he's a homeless guy, And they said, yeah, he fell off his roof. Well, is this a trauma? I'm like, what do we do? Is his vitals okay? His belly, his chest? Did you, oh, no, he's fine. It happened this morning. I'm like, well, of course. So had we gotten on the scene, he may have very well ended up in a full spinal package. But what do you do when they walk in? The EDs don't take them out of the bed. get a history and then lay them flat, put them on a hard board, strap them down, right? They put a collar on their neck, right? So if we get somebody who walks in and sits at the triage desk and sits down and says, yeah, I just fell off my roof. I'm serious. People fall off the roof all the time, or retaining walls. And they say, well, hey, doc, can you come evaluate this patient? They'll put a collar on them, but we just lay them on the gurney, right? And we take them back to the bed. We don't do what we would do in the field, which is stand them up from the chair or slide a KED behind them, or, and then do this kind of takedown. We don't do that in the ER. And so we're just trying to get a little bit more in tune with what we've been really doing kind of in the ED for a while with, ambulatory patients and minor injuries. So this New Thoughts, I highly recommend anybody reading this Oswald's paper. 2012, he wrote a tremendously good, it's only 3 pages, about the physics, the biomechanics of spine injuries. And it's just a tremendous paper. And it's eye-opening. And I think a lot of what we've come to be defending this new practice with is because of this paper. Because he articulates the physics of the spine so well. And we'll talk about some of that. He's got some great points in here. The new thing we want to start talking about is injury, or energy. Energy causes the spine injury, okay? And the injury occurs at the time of the injury. That's what the energy was imparted. So when I was careening 70 miles an hour down the street without a seatbelt, and I star the windshield, and that kinetic energy smashes my head and crunches my neck, that was the bad moment. After we get there, so that injury occurred then. The spine failed, some critical energy was met, and the spine failed. Now, when we get there, we're not advocating for wild, crazy movements. We're advocating for rapid extrication, getting them to the hospital, and not necessarily using the board. Because we'll talk about the movement through the normal range of motion imparts virtually zero energy, right? There's no energy imparted through the normal range of motion. Very interlocking segment the spine is. Now, there's a lot of force implied and energy that occurs when you get shot in the spine or you fall off a building and land on your head. Tremendous amount of kinetic energy taken outside of the normal range of motion. We're not ever advocating for people to have their heads whipped around and going through outside the normal range of motion. But those types of small movements that we apply, the gentle extrication and movements that we do in jostling the field, do not further that injury. And we'll explain why. Energy at the time of the injury is great. Energy during EMS care and extrication is minimal. Motion at the uninjured segments is different than injured segments. And we're equating that visible motion means no force applied. So it's hard to explain. If I have a jumped facets, remember how your spine's kind of like interlocked like this, kind of, and it's got the facets here, and it jumps. I get a horrible injury. This is a terrible injury, and I jump facets here, and I literally cut my cord in half. Really squeeze it. It's a bad cord injury. Took a lot of force to get it there, and it's stuck. It's locked. I'm equating motion with energy. So these 2 segments are hurt bad. But the segments above and below still work okay, right? My T-spine still works fine. My L-spine still works fine. That's not related at all to here, right? The joints above and below, this is the segment that's hurt. But here, this is not hurt at all, right? Force is just going to be the energy is going to be disseminated through the whole spine. It's meant to do that. But my injured segments, they might be stuck. They might literally be fixed with a horrible injury. Now, there's no movement but what if I tried to move his head really hard? I'm moving, there's no movement, but now how much force is that? There's force that's really being applied to those injured segments, right? Because what if I applied them to an uninjured segment? It'd move easy. No energy. Energy be immediately dissipated, right? I can move it and it would go whoop. Low energy. But if I've got a locked C-spine, a dislocation, a bad fracture, it's unstable, and it's spasming and the muscles are contracting and there's edema, and now I move the spine. Now, see the force? There's a lot of force, but not necessarily a lot of movement. So we're equating visible movement. Well, if there's no movement, then there's no force. But that's where the difference is. So if we're pinning people's heads down, we're doing and we've got all these different things that we know, a slippery board and things like that. We're not necessarily causing movement, but we may be applying actually more force to that injured segment than the uninjured segments. This might be explained a little better here in a minute. So the longboard is a low friction surface that has energy to anchor points, right? So we're fixating the head and neck really well, but everything else is low friction. So maybe by minimal movement, we still may be applying forces to the spine. This is wordy, I apologize, but sometimes he just says things so well. The spine requires little energy to move with its normal range of motions. And there's no resistance, right? There's no resistance when I do this. You could take someone's head someone who just passes out, and you just go like this. There's no resistance, no energy imparted. It's moving through its normal range of motion. The spinal cord is designed to move through that normal range of motion, right? Since the spinal components fail at a similar force, this is the key here. Spinal injuries are either minor, with no threat to the cord, or catastrophic, with multiple irreversible failures. Okay? That they will be unaffected by pre-hospital spinal care. That's a big statement. If I break my spine and cut my cord in two, what we do to them is inconsequential. We're talking about tiny movements, right? We're talking about nothing. I mean, I get people critiquing, looking, going, oh, he's moved a little bit. Go, stop worrying about that. This guy's injury occurred when he was stabbed with an axe in the back. Lots of kinetic energy, right? Now we're talking about passive range of motion. Now we're talking about normal range of motion. We're talking about low resistance. We're talking about no energy being imparted. So that's a big difference. If the force experienced to create the unstable fracture was not enough to injure the cord, do you think we could cause enough force to injure it further? So if they fall off a building at 50 feet, land on their head and break their spine, but their cord's still okay, do you think you're going to impart anywhere near the kinetic energy you need to cause more injury than the force of 50-foot fall? You see what I'm saying? This is it's hard because he talks a lot about physics and biomechanics. But if you really digest this makes sense. If his cord's okay after the 300-mile-an-hour rollover, and he's moving everything and feeling everything well, what are you going to do to him that replicates that force? That's insane. You couldn't, right? So that's where he's talking about. It's fascinating. And here's another thing about, let's say we have a spine that's completely not together. Now you're thinking, well, okay, his head will just fall off, and that's bad, right? Well, sure. But, again, if that injury happens, don't you think that injury is final, complete, and catastrophic at that time? Right? If I have an internal decapitation, what we're doing is not the problem, okay? So if the force results in an injury, but no gross instability, additional forces, through prudent rescuing, will spread throughout the whole spine, right? We're not going outside the normal range of motion. We're saying, sit down on the cot, ma'am, and lay down in normal. That's what the spine is designed to do. Most spinal injuries are stable in the short term. Those that are truly unstable and offer no resistance, so let's say both of my C2, C3 are separated. My cord's just in there, and my head's just like a lollipop. It can't hold it up, right? Well, do you know what that happened? Those are irrevocably damaged at the time of the event. The thing that caused his two vertebrae to separate, that was the bad part of his day, not us and our gentle movements. So that's what we're trying to say, is that most spinal injuries are stable. And the ones that aren't, that cause a cord injury, that was catastrophic at the time of the event. We've got to minimize what we thought we were doing to help them, get them to the hospital quicker, and we don't necessarily need a long spine board for that. The spinal column's very, very strong. 2,000 to 6,000 newtons of force to fracture a C-spine. Now, force has motion implied. It's hard to equate to pounds of force. But that's roughly equivalent to 500 to 1,500 pounds of force. They're kind of two non-equivalent measures. But it's a lot. It's very resilient, okay? Now, that's a normal healthy spine. If you take a kyphotic 90-year-old spine that's had 3 fusions, probably a little different, but we're talking in general. If I let a head, hang off of a bed and go whoop, 40 newtons, right? And we think that would be, any one of you could pass out and we could drop your head off of the edge of the bed. No one's head's gonna snap off and break, right? It takes a lot of force to break a C-spine. But we would view that as literally catastrophic. Oh my gosh, that man's head fell off the table. We would literally view that as catastrophic. I think we'd all agree, right? Did you just let that happen? Now, I'm not advocating letting it fall off the cot. I'm not advocating for that. I'm trying to get the broader point across that what we've been doing is overkill for a long time. This is when the injury occurred. That's a lot of kinetic energy going 1,000,000 miles an hour, falling on my head. That's going to be a bad problem. This guy will fall, right? How well do we manage that airway? This is a typical kid we'd take anywhere, right? You see them all the time at Children's. We got a collar, keeping their mouth shut. We got tape. If you don't, heaven forbid if you don't have scissors. And I never carry scissors in the trauma bay. And inevitably I want to cut everything off as soon as they get there, and I can't. We're like ripping at stuff. So this isn't the best way to care for that kid. I mean, how do you manage that airway? How do you bag that? They've shown that BVM is done poorly in C-spine, and you can't do it very well. You just can't do it. You can't move their head, their jaw, you can't do the jaw thrust. It doesn't work very well. So we're not doing a very good job of managing the airway. Evidence for benefit of long spine board, again, we're lacking. Here's some potential benefits to not using it. Reduces the amount of on-scene personnel. Reduce the amount of patients lifted from the ground who are already ambulatory. Remember, we took a patient who was upright. We throw them on the ground and create our own back injuries, right? Reduce the amount of awkward positions we have to put people in. Okay, this lady who has no damage to her vehicle, get in the back of her car and hold her head for her. She's awake, tell her not to move her head. Right? I mean, if I was in a car accident and I was sitting there like, help, my neck hurts, I wouldn't need someone else to tell me not to move my head, right? I'm not purposely going to be whipping it around, especially if it's broke. Reduce scene times by eliminating the scene time immobilizing. We'll look in our videos and we'll show you. It takes 2 minutes and 20 seconds to immobilize someone to a board. In a room, no rain, trained providers, and a non-sick patient and a healthy volunteer. It took us 2 minutes and 20 seconds over and over and over every single time. Man, that's hard, right? That's a lot, 2.5 minutes that you could be 2.5 minutes closer to the hospital. Because what we're proposing for getting people off of a board, 15 seconds, 10 seconds. Exposure of the patient. What does not using a long spine board for transport mean for exposing our patients? How do we get to this person? How do we get to that? Throw a CAD board under that. I swear, you can't get to any portion of that patient's body. They are so strapped to death that you couldn't look at their belly if you wanted to, right? Think in the winter. Now they got full clothes on. Now imagine straps on the cot. Pop, whoop, and now I can look at their belly. I can access it. I can feel. I can squeeze the chest wall. See if I can look and see if there's bruising. Strap that strap back on. Look at the legs. Oh, there's bleeding behind his posterior thigh. How would you get to bleeding if someone's bleeding from like a gunshot wound to the back of their thigh, right in their butt crease or something? How would you get to that? So, you don't, right? You just go, well, I don't see a lot of blood coming out. Maybe he's shot 8 times back there, I don't know. But if you go pop the leg strap, lift the leg up, look, put the, I mean, you can see things. You can look at the back of the leg en route. You can spread the legs and look at something in the groin if you needed to. You could never do that before. You can't look at anything. You could lift their arm up and look. You get more accessibility to the patient. And we do a very bad job of exposing the patient en route. And I know in the winter it's cold, and sometimes, the 5-minute trip, it's not worth getting them all exposed. But we will be able to see people a lot better because the cot straps are much more user-friendly. And they still keep them secured to the bed. Again, we've talked about this is kind of an overview of all the reasons which we think it's good. We're not alone. So I don't want to think this is like some crazy, outlandish new thing about trying to minimize the use of the long spine board, okay? So again, I just want to show you that we're not going to be the only system doing this. We're not going to be the only people adopting, kind of jettisoning the long spine board for transports. I'm going to share with you some other places. Here's just a short list. We've got Minneapolis, St. Paul, Ohio, New Mexico, the states of Connecticut, Minnesota again, Nevada, Colorado. So this right here, this is in Wisconsin. The Maryland and Connecticut are in process. So Mike Millen with Maryland is trying to get the state protocols changed, and David Cohn in Connecticut are trying to get these to be statewide protocols for minimizing long spine board. And if some of them had their way, they would literally take them off immediately. So we're not the only people. And here's Queensland Ambulance as well in Australia. Here's an example protocol wording from Wisconsin. So the SURTAC, the Southeast Regional Trauma Advisory Committee, basically I just bolded it. Backboards and scoop stretchers are designed and should only be used to extricate patients. That was what they came to. Once extricated, patients should be taken off the backboard or scoop stretcher and placed directly on the ambulance stretcher. You recognize this is going to look a lot like Johnson County's. Patients with penetrating trauma should only be immobilized if a focal neurologic deficit is noted on physical exam. And then here's the caveat they put in there, although there's little evidence of benefit even in these cases. Okay? So people are going to inevitably ask, Well, how do you assess a focal neurologic deficit in someone who's unresponsive? You don't. So but we went through the evidence and showed that basically this caveat is placed in there as kind of a cover your butt kind of provision, if you will. It's not really evidence-based, but it's kind of a softball thrown up saying, well, we kind of gotta, if there's an obvious neurologic deficit, but basically they're getting rid of it in penetrating traumas as well. Here's more from Yale New Haven. Effective immediately longboards will no longer be utilized for spinal mobilization of ambulatory patients. They stopped doing standing takedowns. This change in procedure is a first step toward eventually using longboards only when needed to facilitate extrication and not during transport. So again, this is coming. Here we go, Queensland. This is, I think, 5 years old, 3 years old or something like that. I can't get this into, it was a weird document. But basically, they call it an extrication board, which I think is a neat new thing to kind of call the long spine board. If you call it an extrication board, it's not to be used during transport, right? I mean, you wouldn't cardiovert someone with a laryngoscope blade, right? You call it what it does, right? So an extrication board is for extrication. So, and here's the indications. Extrication of a patient onto an ambulance stretcher. And then the next slide. Note, the extrication board is removed prior to transport. Here it is. There is no evidence of benefit from immobilizing a patient to a hard board. This forces the spine and neck into a straight line, which is not the normal anatomic alignment. So they've been doing this for a number of years with good success, okay? More protocol wording here. I'm bolding some of this because you don't need to, it's all saying the same thing. But here's this bold, there's no role for the KED board in EMS. Hallelujah. Someone finally said it, right? And this Queensland, they do not allow transport on line spine board. I mean, that's a contraindication. You use it to get them on the board. You don't transport people on it. So again, these kind of parting thoughts. This is changing culture. This is changing dogma. This is changing everything we ever used to do. I equate this to the not ventilating cardiac arrests. How people literally couldn't have never imagined from how we went 20 and 30 years ago to ventilating them 1,000,000 times a minute to 0 times a minute in the beginning part of the cardiac arrest. That was a big deal. And there needed to be a lot of buy-in. There needed to be a lot, continuous chest compressions, de-emphasizing airway and intubation. I mean, who would have thought that stuff? And I really do think that that's where this is. This is at that stage right now where there's this groundswell of movement around it. People started critically looking at it because no one's really ever looked at it before. And now people are looking under the rock and going, why haven't we asked the question, why are we doing this for the last 40 years? Is this good? Is it the best thing we can do for people? And so I think that's kind of where we're at. Is the same way we were with cardiac arrest, 5 years ago when we kind of started doing the passive oxygenation, continuous chest compressions. I think that's really where this is at. I think it will grow. Now this Oswald guy, again, talking about how people don't like to change, this kind of summarizes this. He basically, the bottom line is, I love this conclusion. Although logic and medical literature support removing all patients from a backboard immediately, physicians were unlikely to change their practice after their formal training had been completed and a new member of their group until somebody from their group started to do so. So basically, I'm not going to be the first. That's basically what that says, is I don't want to be the first. And that's documented. People don't like to change their practice. I mean, there's really good, there's some in the education literature that physicians practice how they're going to practice for their whole life. So I think up to 3, they stop learning after like 3 years after they get out of residency or something like that, where they kind of don't like to learn new stuff. They have to be drugged, kicking and screaming. So we're dragging, kicking and screaming right now. I mean, that's the hard part. Now I like to say I'm exempt from that, obviously. I'm going to keep learning forever. It was a joke. But the point is that physicians and institutions don't like change inherently. And so this is going to be a big change. You're going to have a doctor in an ED or some nurses in an ED, and they're going to raise a stink every now and then about, I can't believe they brought this patient in XYZ condition with XYZ. That's fine, we accept that. And we're going to do our darndest to kind of get this paradigm to move on. The medication had the same risk benefit as a long spine board. It would be stopped immediately by the FDA. Well, that's bottom line. I mean, they wouldn't allow a drug to be approved with that kind of indications, right? And the potential harm, well, all harm with really no benefit. Here's what we when we brainstormed here in Johnson County out at Lenexa Station 3, when was this? August, September? We kind of came up with how are we going to overcome these things? What kind of things do we have to overcome to get it going? So overcoming the dogma, institutional culture, and long-standing traditions. That's a big one. We have to change the culture. The second one was we need buy-in from hospital, helicopter, critical care transport agencies, both the physicians, nursing, and flight crews. We got to get all those groups. So children's critical care, right now I know at children's, the institutional culture is to immobilize patients. They transfer onto a hard board before they come to us at children's. And I think that will change. But right now somebody who's ambulatory at St. Luke's East, who came in for a back pain 2 days earlier, if they go get them, they'll put them on a board usually, and they'll bring them to children's that way. We know it's not great, but that's their institutional culture. We got to change that. But we have to get buy-in. Buy-in from the EMS providers, and that's what most of this is about. Is I wish we're doing our core drive-through training over the next 2 months in Johnson County, and I wish I could do this talk to every EMS provider in Johnson County. I wish they could sit through the whole hour and a half, because I think it's beneficial to hear the buy-in. I want to get the background and the rationale and the logic, the biomechanics, the evidence to explain, so you guys get buy-in. And so I need the EMS administrators and EMS education folks and battalion chiefs and things I need to have you guys carry the torch and try to get this out to the crews and try to explain and but we have to have buy-in from EMS. If we can't get our own providers, just like I had to get buy-in for them to start pushing on the chest without pausing and not ventilating somebody. That's a big deal, but we had to get the buy-in and the rationale why. Risk management, liability. Inevitably people ask, well, what about a lawsuit? I don't have any answer to that other than we've got now enough people in this country doing this and enough experts in emergency medicine at the national level who could easily rebut or refute anything that somebody else could throw at you at this point, and I think we're to that point. It would be just like, why aren't you doing the American Heart Association's cardiac arrest protocol? Does anybody ever ask that? It says AHA is the standard. Well, we don't do AHA, right? A lot of people don't do PALS. A lot of people don't do stuff like that, so no one really asked that question. So I kind of throw it back at him and say, there's a lot of stuff we do that's not like the gold standard from ACLS. You get trained in ACLS and then we put you on the streets and do something completely different. Well, no one really questions that. So it's the same thing. This is what the textbook says for spinal cord immobilization, but this is what we're doing. And we're doing it based on a logical rationale, a deliberate rollout with a lot of community buy-in from our trauma centers and national partners. Ensuring proper documentation in QA. We have to look at this. We're training on this in January, February, and we will then be rolling it out March 1. There will be hiccups. I'm not naive. There will be a bump in the road. I will inevitably get phone calls from people saying, what do we do in this scenario? Well, we didn't anticipate that. How do you want us to handle that? Absolutely, and that's what we're going to want, that feedback. And we're going to want the feedback from the hospitals and the nurses. We want the doctors to call us, hey, FYI, that lady they brought the other day, she had 2 C-spine fractures. That's useful, because then we can look at that and see, did we take good care of her spine? The long spine board doesn't necessarily have to be a part of that, but did we take good care of her spine? Did we assess the spine? Did we document that they had pain? Did we document a neurologic exam? Did we care for them well? Did we use scoops? Did we use slide boards? Did we use how did we get them to the cot? Did we document everything appropriately and secure them to the stretcher and things like that? So we're going to look at that, and we want to know if we had any misses. But we still have to ask ourselves the question, okay, so she had a broken spine. Is there something we did in the field that made that worse? The answer's probably inevitably going to be no. But we have to still do careful, thoughtful spinal care, and so we're not advocating for reckless care. And the educational rollout, which we're in process of doing. Equipment issues, differences between agencies. What do you carry? Did everybody carry a scoop on a fire truck? What kind of strapping techniques do you have? What kind of boards? Some people in different agencies have kind of those boards that have, I know in other parts of the country they have like almost a scoop to them a little bit, like they're a little, it might not be as conducive to a certain technique we're trying to remove the board from. Some have different strapping devices that are already preloaded. Most people don't have straps on their scoop stretchers. I think they could probably be put on, and we may actually look at that. We may slide boards, making sure that the hospitals have equipment and slide boards to move people back and forth to a hospital bed and to CT and things like that. And then that also brings up budgetary issues. If we suddenly need a bunch extra XYZ on the ambulances, and that's what we're really using, that becomes a budgetary issue. So there's other things we're going to work through. The logistics, what are the procedures that we're actually going to do? How are we going to make sure that there's a good way to get someone off a board once we put them off the board? What if they're already on a board when you get there, strapped up and taped down to the board? Then what do you do? There's a 10-minute response time. The BLS crew got them all packaged. What's the ALS person supposed to do? Do you undo everything they just did? I mean, that kind of communication between the BLS and ALS providers is important, so they know what the expectations are. Appropriate wording of the protocol to ensure common understanding and intent. So when we're at the protocol, we don't want people to look at it and go, I have no idea what this says. So we've vetted the protocol as best we can vet it right now. We update the protocols every year, and I'm sure there'll be tweaks and changes, but the idea is to make it something that was fairly straightforward and understandable. And then overcoming differences with state and national curriculums and standards, right? If I'm doing this here in this county, and then every new paramedic and EMT pumped out of JUCO has no idea what we're talking about, that's going to be a rude awakening day one on the ambulance. I mean, they're going to be jumping in the back of the car, holding that C-spine, and they're going to be like, "What are you doing, man? We're good. Just we're good." And so, just back away from the patient, right? Drop the collar. No. But I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. I'm saying that educational stuff lags. If I take my emergency medicine boards tomorrow, they will not be doing passive oxygenation in a cardiac arrest. They will not be doing some of the stuff that we currently practice routinely. They will not be doing that. It lags. ACLS lags, PALS lags, a lot of stuff. There's a lag in evidence, getting it all together and publishing it. So textbooks lag. I expect probably 10 years from now, the paramedic curriculum textbooks to have this stuff in it. Maybe I'm being overly cynical. Maybe it's 5 years from now. I don't know. But there's enough grassroots people and EMS physicians involved in this that this is growing, and so I think this stuff will be happening at the but we do have to talk to people about what the requirements are. And Brad Cusick, Chief Cusick, Overland Park, brought up to KEMSA about a regulation about what's required on the ambulance. Well, one of the things that was required is a long spine board, and it says, well, I guess, in theory. Maybe it's not required anymore, or some of the stuff that, the short boards, the KED, I think the KED board was required, the KED. And so we're like, well, really? Maybe that's something. So we're talking about regulatory change at the state level. So there's a lot of things that we're going to run into, and we'll have to overcome. This is the Johnson County protocol. I'm bolding because none of it really changed except the bold. Patients with penetrating traumatic injury should not be immobilized, okay? And again, we have this caveat because I couldn't really find anybody that didn't do that, but I think that's just more of a cover your back end. Basically, we showed you that the evidence, it doubles mortality. You should not be immobilizing and wasting time on scene with someone who's shot in the head, neck, or torso. And I would assume you wouldn't do it if they were shot in the leg, right? But we shouldn't be doing it. So we're emphasizing penetrating trauma is a load and go. Be thoughtful and careful. You can use the board to scoop them off the floor or a scoop or whatever and put them on the board and then on the cot and take them off. The other part of the bolded here, I know this is hard to read from a distance, but it's just the protocol. If they're ambulatory, place a collar, have them sit on the cot, help them sit up. They can be in the position of comfort, okay? They were ambulatory, right? So they don't have to go suddenly from ambulatory to completely supine. They can go from ambulatory to recline on the cot and secured appropriately. Patients that are stable, alert, and oriented without neurologic deficits can be allowed to self-extricate, okay? Just like we talked about those 2 studies that showed 4 times more spinal movement with traditional extrication techniques than controlled self-extrication. And what is controlled self-extrication? It's controlled self-extrication. It's not run out of the car and jump in my ambulance. It's let's do a good assessment, assess your spine. Do you need a collar like you'd normally would? Do you have any neurologic deficits? You feeling everything? You moving everything okay? Get your collar on. We're going to get the cot out right next to you. We're going to help you to stand up. We're going to pivot you and sit you down the cot. It's controlled. It's educating them. And these aren't time critical, right? All these minor MVCs, this isn't like you can't take that 2 seconds to explain to them what you're doing. We're concerned that you have a spine injury, so we want to be careful, but let's get you on the cot. And so that's what that is. And last, Pete, for a long spine board or scoops are used for extrication or patient movement. You can take them, you can get them up out of the ravine on the board, box them in, strap them on, carry them up. But once you're on the cot, you can take them off the board. And we'll show you how we're going to do that. Here's some issues that we've come up. What do you do with a multiple boarded patient? So we used to put one on the bench seat, right? I don't know what the answer is. I guess to call another ambulance. I mean, because I don't think we can put them, I don't think we're going to be able to do that unless we keep them on the board. And ideally, we shouldn't be keeping them on the board. So if we want to keep them on a board, you could put them on the bench seat like you used to, but that may be a change in logistics of how we normally did stuff. What about, and we decided that putting them in the captain's chair is not appropriate. It probably is, in all honesty, but it seems extra, but we're just not there yet. Right? I can't imagine pulling up in a C-collar and getting them out of the front seat. Hey, just step on out and walk into the ER, right? Now, maybe we get there 20 years from now, but right now it just seems a little too much too fast, so we're not going to do that. Vomiting patient that's not on a board. How do you roll a patient who's just on the cot, who has a C-collar on, who starts to vomit? What do you do with them? One, you can sit them up now, right? Because their hips, right? Flexion at the hip joint doesn't mean I move my C-spine or T-spine, right? That doesn't really, I mean, if you can watch my head here, my neck, doing this does not cause me, I could go to a right angle, doesn't really cause any movement of my C-spine, right? And likewise, if I have L-spine pain only, do I need a C-collar? And we'll get to there later, but we're not changing how we normally do the C-collar. But my point is, remember the logic, the philosophy here. Remember the spine, if it's hurt right here, this part doesn't necessarily need to be immobilized. So that's why position of comfort on the cot's okay. So you can sit them up, you can roll them, and if they're conscious, alert, and okay, they can roll to their side. I can't remember if I have a picture in here where the patient rolled on their side with straps on and a pillow under their head. But that's something we're going to have to work on and figure out what the best way to do that. The gravid patient, what about the big third trimester who's laying flat on her back that used to be able to tip the board? Yeah, she may have sagged, her belly would have sagged, and her head stuck to the board, so it probably wasn't the best idea anyway. But that used to be an easy way to prop a couple pillows under the board and kind of tip her, right? Well, we're probably going to maybe you have to start that patient on their side when they get to the ambulance. When they get on the board, and you're going to have to roll them and get them propped up before you go. Get towel rolls. Maybe we have to get foam wedges. Maybe we have to get, there's some other equipment issues. Football players with helmets on. Fortunately, it's not football season, but this spring we'll have to deal with that. And remember now that we've changed everything, someone who's sitting on the bench, someone who's standing up with some trainer holding his head, it may be appropriate now to just get everything off while he's standing, put the collar on and lay him on the cot. So this is where we have to be involved with athletic trainers as well. So we're going to have to, we didn't really change that's a unique thing with the helmets, but we'll have to look at that as the season approaches. We'll have to do some training, and we'll have to do some focus group probably stuff with field providers, with people simulating that and how best to do that. Swimming pools. Someone brought that up the other day, that all the lifeguards around here are great. All the local fire departments train them. They show up and they're already packaged on a board, and they're big foam. I mean, they're really good usually. Well, what do you do? I mean, when the lifeguards are all standing around and you guys go pop, pop, snap, snap, undo, and they're like, get them off of it. I mean, that would look weird, right? But we're going to have to touch base with them. I mean, we're going to have to decide when to do that. Maybe that's best to put them in the ambulance to do it, so they don't even have to see it. Maybe sometimes protecting people from themselves is okay. Like the mom and dads on the sideline and the trainers, Monday night, Friday night football out at Shawnee Mission, and you're on the stadium, there's 5,000 people in the stands, and they're, what did they just, you got 15 orthopedic surgeons pointing fingers going, oh my gosh, yeah. And so what they envision is, Timmy's going on a full ride to walk and just collapse into a heap because of a C-spine injury, right? So we're going to have to think about that kind of stuff, and that's where we have to educate the athletic trainers in the community as well. Here, look at that. Isn't that kind of nice? She's secured in a C-collar, and look at her spine. I mean, people can be on their sides and have their spine protected, right? That's what you do in the ER. I mean, we roll them. Ready? Oh, he's vomiting. Roll him. I mean, they live on there. They can be on their sides. It's not like a prohibition against sides. So, but you would never. I mean, I can't remember where I got this. This is clearly Europe, because who would have that vehicle here? But I mean, that looks reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, so that might be an alternative. This might be something that we end up looking into, like, well, this guy's just vomiting his guts up. Maybe that's the way he starts out for the transport. That's not an unreasonable thing. Put a pillow underneath the head, and you're keeping the spine pretty well. So, I love this one too. So again, I think the seat collar and the spine board is kind of like this, which this seemed like a good idea. You know, propping your car up, working, doing a little work. But inevitably that'll fail. And I think that if we looked closer at it and we evaluated it, we'd probably say that wasn't a good idea. I think this is maybe the best use that we'll see a good market in the future. And I might have dibs in this, about what all those extra spine boards in the country are going to be used for. And I do think art is it's a thought. And the best picture ever, which is local. I love it. This is local. And I'm sorry if you're from the CMS service, but busted. Check out that chick. How awesome is that? That is the best picture ever. So that was in the newspaper, and it was local, and but now how serious? I mean, but see, now that you've had this talk and you've listened to all the evidence and you've looked and thought like, oh well, doesn't that seem even? It seemed funny before, but now doesn't it seem just ridiculous and unbelievable that we could ever do something like that yesterday, right? So it's not like this was 30 years ago. I mean, this happens. It happens all over. And now you look at it and you go, oh my gosh, really? Stand there. You know, I mean, this is awesome. So that's where we're at, and currently, and I think we can make some improvement. So that's it. Do you guys have any questions at all?